Hello. Right, we'll crack on. So thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar. Today we're going to be talking about overheating versus acoustic comfort. Many of you may have come across this issue on developments. We're coming across it on many developments at the moment we're working on. So we're hoping to put together a bit of a presentation on the matter to help you guys out. Also, we're going to record it and send it around afterwards. So this will hopefully become a useful resource for when we're discussing overheating and acoustic comfort with clients and environmental health officers, etc. And we've got our sort of approach set out clearly. So hopefully you find it useful. I've got my colleague Sam Bryant sitting in with me. So if you've got any questions, please type them in the chat box at the bottom, and then Sam can let me know and read them out. And we'll do questions at the end, but if you have any questions you want to ask as we go, please just write them in and we'll try and get to them. Excellent. So the overheating versus acoustic comfort question really boils down to, is it okay to open a window? So we're going to try and answer that question for you. So looking at the basics, I should say this is the you'll be able to see the image showing the flow of what we're going to discuss today across the screen. So we'll go through the basics, talk about the problem, look at what the acoustic guidance out there says, the overheating guidance, where we believe what we believe is a balanced view, taking all the guidance in our experience, having that in mind, and then the future and what that looks like in this area. So looking at basics. Ventilation, one of the factors here is a requirement to provide ventilation in building regulations part F. There's 3 requirements: background ventilation, which is often provided by trickle vents. We're talking about residential properties here. Boost ventilation, which is extract from wet rooms. So from kitchens and bathrooms, you walk in, typically you turn the light on and a fan will ramp up. And purge ventilation, which is defined as 4 air changes per hour in affected rooms. So that's normally provided with an openable window. So purge ventilation is for the removal of fumes, burnt toast, but also it helps control thermal comfort. So energy usage is covered in part L1A of the building regulations for dwellings. There's no criteria in the regulations for overheating. In this country, we're mainly concerned with preserving energy in winter. So we've been designing buildings to be more and more be better and better at keeping heat in. So there's nothing in the regs that requires us to let heat out. That said, in the SAP 2012, which is the procedure used under Part L1A for assessing energy usage, there is a procedure you can use in Appendix P for assessing overheating, the likelihood of overheating. And it's quite, we'll talk about that later, but it's quite a simplified method. Sound insulation to facades, there's no building regulations requirements, so this is driven through the planning process, and typically you'll need to put in noise impact assessments with planning applications, and planning conditions will be imposed that you'll then need to comply with. So there is sound insulation criteria for internal partitions in the building regulations, which is Part E of the building regulations, but nothing relating to noise ingress through facades or windows, or any discussion on open windows. So at this point, in terms of sound insulation, we often, when we're designing developments to achieve good quality internal environments, we'll upgrade glazing and ventilation to, on noisier sites to achieve acceptable levels inside. And you can achieve 25 to 45 dB reduction across a facade with glazing and ventilation, and the better performance glazing, better performance ventilation, obviously the higher performance. But when you open the windows, regardless of what your glazing ventilation system is, you reduce the performance of the facade down to about 10 to 15 dB. So the analogy is a bit like a bucket of water with a hole in it. if you can upgrade the thickness of the bucket as much as you like, but the water will still flow out of the hole. Okay, so there's some basics on the building regulations. The specific problem we're talking about is this. So you're in your apartment or house. You're located in a busy area next to a main road. It's a hot day, so the room starts heating up, feels warm. So you open a window. As soon as you open the window, it's now noisy inside. So it begs the question, do you keep the window open and enjoy the noise, or close the window and enjoy the heat? What would you do? What would a normal person do? And I think the answer really is it depends on what you were planning to do or what you were doing at the time. It depends on how noisy it is, what your tolerance of heat is, tolerance of noise, and that will depend on the activity, what time of day it is. You know, there's huge amounts of variables that might dictate your behavior and how happy you are with the environment that you're in. And obviously there's extremes to this. If you're in a situation where the dwelling is overheating for the whole of summer and you have to keep your window open for the whole of summer, that would be, I think everyone could agree, unacceptable if it's very noisy as a result. On the other hand, if you only had to open your window for 10 minutes on one day in summer at the other extreme, then clearly that would be acceptable. So what a normal person might find reasonable or acceptable is going to be somewhere in that middle area. And the challenge for us as designers is to try and set out an appropriate level of overheating protection and noise protection as well. Okay, so hopefully that's making sense so far. There's a question there. Send the presentation to us by email. Yep, no problem. We'll send that round afterwards. Okay, so looking at the acoustic guidance, these are our main tools that we use when we're appraising sites and informing the design of buildings. So there's government planning guidance, which you'll hopefully all be familiar with, the NPPF, the noise planning policy guidance, the noise policy statement for England. These are the main planning guidance documents on noise, defining development in the UK. There's the World Health Organization noise guidelines for the European region, which basically present the results of various research done on the effects of noise on health. So that guidance underpins a lot of the later guidance, such as BS 8233, which is the British standard that many of you probably be familiar with. You normally see this standard referenced in planning conditions, local council planning policy, that sort of thing. Pro-PG, Planning and Noise, which is an industry guide that was produced a couple of years ago, and this gives more detailed guidance above and beyond 8233 on how to plan and design developments to achieve good noise environments. And then there's the AVO guide, which you may not have heard of this. So this is the Acoustics, Ventilation and Overheating Guide. It's currently in draft format, and we'll talk about what that contains shortly. So going through those in turn and what they tell us, the government planning guidance, NPPF, etc., tells us nothing. There's nothing in there about noise affecting openable windows. Nothing in there about how much time you can spend with the window open, etc. And it's worth saying at this point that we're talking here mainly about anonymous noise, which is generally considered to be road traffic, trains, aircraft. If we're assessing industrial noise, we'd look at that slightly differently. So please bear that in mind, because industrial noise can be more likely to disturb residents than other noise. So, okay, so the WHO noise guidelines, as I said before, this looks at research assessing the effect of noise on health and well-being, and the outcome of the noise guidelines is basically external noise targets for dwellings in Europe, and these are very low aspirational targets, would be exceeded across most of the UK, but they're useful for informing the development of more specific criteria. Again, there's no specific studies referred to in the noise guidelines that reference the conflict between openable windows and resultant internal noise levels. So nothing in there that can help us. That said, what the WHO guidance does tell us quite clearly is that effects on sleep represent the largest burden of disease for noise. So noise waking people up during the middle of the night has the most apparent impact on people's health and well-being. BS 8233, Guidance on Sound Insulation Noise Reduction for Buildings, is a key document we use all the time. And this presents these internal noise criteria, which I won't go into in any detail, but they're very useful. So they tell us when we're designing dwellings how to design the facades to achieve acceptable internal levels, and these are the internal levels that we aim for. 8233 doesn't say much about the issue of openable windows and whether these limits should apply when windows are open, although it does say, as shown on the screen, that windows can remain openable for rapid or purge ventilation or at the occupant's choice, which gives the impression that we should achieve these internal levels. If you need to open the windows for short periods, then there's a expectation that internal levels will be a bit higher as a result. Does this mean the limit shouldn't apply? It doesn't specifically say that, so not clear. If you do apply the limits, as I said before, if you open a window to a room, you reduce the sound insulation level down to about 10 to 15 dB. So if we take the lower 10 level for that, and you apply that to the internal criteria, so we're saying what's the allowable external level to achieve those internal criteria if a window is open, then this table would show the levels. And again, I won't go into them in detail. Suffice to say they're very low, and you would struggle to achieve these in most urban areas. So if you do try and apply the 8233 levels with windows open, you're never really going to comply with them in any urban area, as a general rule. There will always be exceptions. Okay, so Pro-PG planning and noise. This is quite information rich, this slide, so I'll go through it very quickly, but I wanted to get this text on here because if you're looking back through this presentation, then it's useful. But the key thing about it is the planning and noise touches on this issue of overheating versus openable windows, and it says special care must be taken, good standard of acoustics must be achieved, more detailed assessment should be provided. However, it unfortunately doesn't give us any specific guidance on how that type of assessment should be carried out. So it shows us the problem, but it doesn't quite help us solve that problem in a repeatable way. So this was the main purpose of the AVO guide when it was produced back in February 2018. And so the AVO guide's acoustics, ventilation, overheating. It was produced by a mixture of bodies, including the Institute of Acoustics, and it's used to assess the noise, what they call the noise risk during the overheating conditions. So this would normally be when people have opened their windows. It's loosely based on the WHO guidance studies and the external criteria in WHO. And as it points out throughout the document, a lot of the conversion of the WHO guidance criteria to the criteria in the AVO guide is loosely based on other bits of information that are in other guides. So when you look through how these criteria have been reached, there's a large number of assumptions that have been made, and the implications of the resultant criteria are quite significant. So, but as I said before, if you apply the 8233 criteria to an open window situation, you end up with problems everywhere. You have the same sort of outcome using the AVO guide. So if you do use the AVO guide, you're going to it's going to tell you to put in mechanical ventilation or cooling. There's lots of emphasis on comfort cooling in many urban sites. Obviously, that has sustainability considerations. So, the guide's been a draft for almost 2 years, and our view is that it's a draft. It's still a draft for a reason, which is fundamentally it's based on quite a large number of assumptions, and there's a lack of supporting research in that guide. Fingers crossed that research is done and we end up with a really solid guide that we can all rely on. But for now, our view is that AVO guide shouldn't be used, as that doesn't represent, unfortunately, doesn't quite have the weight behind it. Okay, so in summary of the acoustic criteria, there's no guidance in government planning policy on overheating versus acoustics. A233 suggests that it's okay to have windows open, but it is ambiguous and open to interpretation. Pro-PG asks for assessment, but there's no specific guidance on how such an assessment should be carried out. And the AVO guide does go a bit further to provide guidance, but it's based on limited research and the implications are significant. And as I said before, until that's formally approved, which I'm not sure is going to happen, then I don't think we can rely on it. So as a result, it's somewhat unsurprising that consultants such as ourselves, local authorities have different views on what is acceptable when designing dwellings. So then we can look at the overheating guidance that's out there. Overheating, as I'm sure you know, is dictated by various thermal gains in properties, so from equipment, largely from solar gains, which obviously depends on window sizes and orientation, the time of year. The ability for the building to shed heat, so G values of glazing, for example, and how they're ventilated and what rate they're ventilated. So in a normal project, this would be assessed by the energy consultant, who would do a CIBSE assessment or a SAP assessment. CIBSE TM59 is the current best practice for assessing overheating. And again, I won't go into the detail of the text on the bottom right-hand side, but that's the criteria in CIBSE TM59 for what they define as overheating. You'll see for nighttime, the bedroom, if a bedroom is less than 26 degrees for more than 1% of annual hours, that's not considered to be overheating. I mean, personally, 25 degrees would be very hot. If I prefer to have a cool bedroom, so that would be a bit hot for me. But that's the criteria. Those are the criteria. SAP 2012, as I said before, Appendix P has a rough and ready method for assessing overheating, and that can also be used to calculate the air change per hour to bring that down. So the air change per hour, as I said, in relation to ventilation, that would normally be provided, if there wasn't a noise issue, by an openable window. So massive increase in the movement of air through a room, and as a result, you can control the temperature a lot better. So our experience of working with energy consultants on our developments and your developments is that if you can't rely on openable windows, then the dwellings will always overheat. If you don't have those high ventilation rates that you get with an open window, you will always have an overheating problem. I haven't seen an assessment that has showed that without any specific treatment or enhanced ventilation, that windows can remain closed without unit overheating. So the only solution there, therefore, is enhanced ventilation or cooling. Cooling, as we said before, is not an option. Generally, cost and sustainability. I heard the other day, apparently America uses more energy, more electricity to cool buildings than Africa uses in total, because that's what they do there. So clearly, with the environmental concerns we all have, that's not an option. Mechanical ventilation is an option, but you need to achieve really high air change rates through a mechanical system to provide the same level of ventilation that you get with an open window. Often it doesn't need to be the full 4 air changes per hour, which is the purge requirement for Windows in Part F, but it will need to be significant, and as a result you'll end up with very big mechanical systems. So either oversized MVHR systems, we see those used a fair bit, and you can have purge fans to affected rooms as well, which are basically just inline fans that blow air into a room to allow the windows to stay closed. There are options out there for large, I mean, you can have a large acoustic passive vent installed in the facade, and we have seen them on a few developments. The issue with them is they're huge, you know, over a meter squared often, and therefore they need to be designed into the facade very early on in the design process, so much later than, you know, a planning consent really, because it would be beyond the scope of a planning condition to implement them given the effects they would have on the external appearance. So taking all the various research and issues in mind, we adopt this balanced view. Firstly, that thermal and acoustic comfort is most important at night. As I said before, the WHO guidance is very clear that impacts on sleep represent the biggest risk to health and well-being. It's much more achievable to allow bedrooms to keep their windows closed at night because we don't have solar gains. So it's more about ensuring that the development can reduce the daytime overheating condition quickly enough that by night time you can keep the windows closed. And again, TM59 is the best practice for assessing overheating as it stands, so we would always encourage that to be used. It's acceptable to rely on openable windows during the daytime on Pro-PG low and medium risk facades. So Pro-PG provides a useful graph or chart, which I've shown on the right-hand side of the screen, which presents the noise risk for a site based on the external levels, average levels during the day and nighttime. So we take the view that provided the daytime levels are within the medium, low or negligible range on that noise risk chart, that it's fine to rely on openable windows for overheating during the daytime. That said, we do recommend that overheating is reduced as far as practicable through non-ventilation methods. So the selection of good quality glazing, wrapping, pipework with insulation, all the other little bits and bobs you can do to try and reduce the overheating assessment down. When you get into the higher noise levels, so on the Pro-PG chart there, the high risk end, they're very noisy sites, you know, central London or very close to a main road. At those sorts of levels, it's appropriate, and we recommend that that enhanced mechanical ventilation is provided, at the very least to reduce the overheating condition down to the minimum time possible. So it's still not necessarily unacceptable for someone to open a window for short periods, but you wouldn't want to put someone in a position where they have to endure open windows and high noise levels for very long periods throughout the summer. So as I said before, there's a range of views that we come across due to the lack of guidance at the moment, and this arrow across the bottom sort of indicates the scale of those views. So on one hand, to the left, we see the situation where there's no assessment of overheating and not considered at all. Noise levels when windows are open are not considered. This obviously represents the risk of someone being in the situation where they have to have their windows open for very long periods. So that would be one hand. On the other hand, we also have come across projects where local authorities or energy consultants have suggested that the 8233 internal levels should be achieved at all times. And this always requires mechanical ventilation, as I said before, and it can result in the over-specification of mechanical systems that on fairly quiet sites, really. And the question there is whether residents will actually benefit from them at all or use them. or whether they'll just open a window. So if you look at where BS8233 and the AVO guide sort of sit on this scale, you know, it's sort of those positions. We believe the balanced view that put forward in the previous slide sits somewhere in the middle. So it's more definitive than 8233, which doesn't give us much advice, but it doesn't go as far as the AVO guide, which, as I said before, is slightly questionable. So that balanced view, in our view, it complies with general planning guidance, represents good quality housing. It's in line with the WHO guideline advice around sleep adverse sleep effects, so protecting people's health and well-being. Compliant with 8233. It's compliant with Pro-PG in that we've looked at it in detail and we've put forward a balanced approach. And it's generally in line with the principles of what the AVO guide is trying to achieve, although it doesn't go quite as far. So where we typically get involved, we can look at sites early on and give you some early advice on what the implications of noise and overheating may be on your development. We work with the energy consultants to come up with solutions, and a big part of it as well is just helping everyone in the team, you know, including the environmental health officers, agree an appropriate assessment methodology up front. Often we see in planning conditions and specifications the overheating criteria or noise criteria specified with open windows, etc. And these can represent really large risks to projects because of the cost and the implications of putting in systems that may not be required. So that summarizes our balanced view on the matter. What does the future look like? Well, hopefully more research and better formal guidance. So the AVO guide is a step in the right direction, but it really needs to be underpinned by really good quality research, so we know that we're all doing the right things. I could see overheating being considered earlier in the design process. We're already seeing overheating assessments being required more and more in planning conditions, for example, and I wouldn't be surprised if they start being required. I mean, well, we've seen them required in planning applications as well, but I think that's going to become more common. And this will probably result in more fundamental changes to buildings to help with the overheating issue. So thermally reflective facades, thermal mass, possibly not thermal mass, but solar shading in particular is an easy way of reducing the overheating problem. These obviously aren't new concepts, they've been used in other countries for thousands of years. Also, personally, I can see thermal comfort becoming a selling point as well. We've seen adverts on the you know, marketing material and ads on the tube lines promoting developments based purely on good quality acoustics, because people moving into flats want to know they're not going to be disturbed. But I think as well, it's a great selling point. If I was buying a property in London, I'd really want to know, or anywhere, I'd really want to know that I could keep my windows open, or it's not going to overheat for long periods. That would be a real consideration for me. I've lived in a student house that was boiling all of the time, and it was absolutely awful. So that would be important to me, and I think it'd be important to a lot of people as well. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation.